website afterwards. So thanks so much for coming. I'm Ali Phipps. I'm Professor of Sociology at Newcastle University, and I work on sexual violence amongst other things. This seminar is being hosted by Sociology, the Gender Research Group, and the Abolition Feminism for Ending Sexual Violence Collective, which I co-organise with Nikki Godden-Rasool, who's Senior Lecturer in Law, and Tina Sicker, who's Reader in Technoscience and Intersectional Justice, who are both also on the call with us. The Abolition Feminism Collective is our little space for more transformative and abolitionist thinking in the academy. If you're not already a member, you're very welcome to join it. I can send some details around after today. So this event is called Whose Campus, Whose Security? And it's based on the report with the same title, which is co-authored by Dr. Remi Joseph-Salisbury and Dr. Laura Connelly, who I'm really delighted have come to speak to us about the report today. The report is really important and groundbreaking. It's the first empirical account of students' views on and experiences of security services and police on UK university campuses, which is much needed. I think you'll agree, especially after the latest news articles on UK campus security services lobbying universities and taking some tips from their US counterparts in policing protests around Gaza. The report was produced by the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, and Laura and Remi co-authored it together. They have very impressive bios, both of them, which I'm assuming you've already read if you've signed up to the event, so I won't read them out again, but just to say they are leading scholars in the area of anti-racist activism and thinking in this country. It's such a pleasure to have them here. Laura is Senior Lecturer in Criminology in the School of Sociological Studies, Politics and International Relations at Sheffield, and Remi is Reader in Sociology at the University of Manchester. Laura and Remi have not only co-authored this report together, but they're also co-authors of Anti-Racist Scholar Activism, which came out from Manchester University Press in 2021. It's a brilliant book, and it won the US Society of Professors of Education Outstanding Book Award in 2023. It's well worth a read if you haven't read it already. So Remi and Laura will talk for about 40 minutes, after which we'll have Q&A, either in the chat or you're welcome to stick your hand up and speak. I think they will give an overview of the report and then focus in on the bits that are directly relevant to sexual violence, since that's the focus of a lot of people that are attending. So I will hand over to them now without any further ado. Thank you so much, Laura and Remi.
Thanks, Alison. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to share some slides. Okay, can you see those okay? Can you just, yeah, great, thumbs up. Thank you for that. Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. Really pleased to be on the call with you all today. So thank you for taking time out of what we know are really, really busy schedules to come along and attend. A huge thanks to Alison, Nikki and Tina for inviting us to speak. We're really pleased to be here. And also a big thanks, we owe a big thanks to Alison as well for supporting this broader project. She provided feedback on this draft report and even came up with the title, actually, when we were at a complete loss. As Alison said, we'll share some findings from our research on campus securitization, thinking specifically about the role of campus security services. And we'll highlight some key issues from participants generally, and then we will spend a bit more time focusing in on sexual violence specifically. I think it's probably worth noting before we start that while we focus on students' experiences with security services, the issues that we highlight try to speak to kind of broader priorities and policies and decision-making at the institutional level. So things shaped not just by security personnel on the ground, but by the structures that govern them. In other words, the critiques that we make are intended to operate on the institutional rather than the individual level. So we plan to deliver this session today a bit more as an interactive workshop, but given that we've shifted online and because of the numbers of people signed up, we've gone for something a bit more presentational style. But just to say, we are really keen to hear from the expertise in the room, so we'll make sure to leave plenty of time for some discussion as well. So our research then was undertaken between 2022 and 2023. So it took place against the backdrop of the global Black Lives Matter mobilisations in 2020, which, as you might remember, reignited discussions about institutional racism, including within universities. And it resulted in lots of HE institutions making these public declarations about their commitments to addressing racism and other forms of inequity, often framed through the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda. Our work also follows a long history of student-led activism, including around the securitisation of university campuses. And it also emerges from a context in which this activism has been kind of punctuated in recent times by multiple crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic, deepening social injustices, and multiple high-profile incidents involving campus security. One of these such cases then, and lots of you will be familiar with this, involved Zach Aden, who was a first-year student at the University of Manchester, who back in November 2020, so this was during the second national lockdown period, he accused security personnel of racial profiling after he was apprehended on his way back to his student halls from a local shop. Reflecting on the incident in a BBC Three documentary then, Zach noted that security personnel told him that there'd been a lot of drug dealing going on campus before being, as he said, pinned up against the wall. He reported being left traumatised by the situation, with the harm that he experienced really being compounded in the following days and weeks and months by the university's mishandling of the situation. We wanted to mention then Zach's experience because although we'd spoken about these sorts of issues on and off for a couple of years before Zach's encounter, his experience was very much the catalyst for us actually getting started with this research project. However, contrary to how experiences like Zach's are portrayed, these encounters are not isolated. And this is a big part of what our research tries to show. Even still, there are other high-profile cases that underline the connected nature of this phenomenon, such as Femi Nylander, a Black Oxford graduate who had his CCTV image circulated across staff and students alongside a warning to be vigilant on campus. Or also Priyambada Gopal, a Cambridge professor who spoke out after being treated by porters as if her staff ID card might have been forged. So all three insisted that these experiences reflect wider patterns in racialized securitization on campus. And just to give a bit of a kind of glimpse at this wider picture, there are sort of any number of incidents that could illustrate the growing securitization of university campuses. The examples I'll show now, we've chosen that because they span a whole range of different time periods. So before and after our report, and across various institutions, both nationally and internationally. Just for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, during the lockdown period, the University of Manchester installed fences all around student accommodation, sparking accusations of heavy-handed securitization, as well as a disregard for students' mental health. Student protests quickly followed the fences, forcing the university to back down and remove them. Around the same time, again, at the University of Manchester, students formed a Cops Off Campus group to monitor the increasing presence of police and security on campus. The year before that, just down the road at the University of Salford, Salford entered into a multi-million-pound deal with Greater Manchester Police to deliver policing degree programmes. And that reflected that kind of broader trend we've seen in HE of universities becoming sites of police training. Last year, the same year, around 2020, 2021, Sheffield Hallam students staged a rent strike occupation and were met with force by security officers. So videos circulated of security officers pinning students to the ground inside of a university building. And last year at the University of Sheffield, Sheffield spent close to £500,000 on security around the pro-Palestine protests, while incidentally, its financial struggles are so great this year that it's now cutting degree programmes and making widespread staff redundancies. Beyond these examples then, we've seen this pattern of heavy-handed responses to pro-Palestine student protests, including against encampments like this one from Birmingham, as well as in the US, Canada, and across Europe. And as Alison said, you may have seen the media reports from this weekend revealing that the UK chair of the Association of University Chief Security Officers actually attended a US campus law enforcement conference to learn from the American universities around their heavy-handed handling of the pro-Palestine encampments. And according to reports, UK university leaders assured the UK chief that security teams here would have their full backing if things got tough. While some of our research participants did highlight policing and the surveillance of Palestine solidarity groups, our work was conducted before the significant mobilisations of 2024, so more attention is definitely needed to those experiences. Nonetheless, what our research tried to do was uncover the connections between some of these different articulations of securitisation and consider the wider context, uncovering stories and perspectives that didn't make the headlines. So what we tried to show then that these headlines are really just the tip of the iceberg. Before we share some of our findings, just really briefly, a little bit about the project. So alongside a journal article that we have in Ethnic and Racial Studies, which looks at the racialized construction of so-called criminal outsiders on campus, we've so far published the research as this report here with our colleagues, Kerry Pimblott, Siobhan O'Neill and Harry Taylor. And you can read the full report at the link that I think Remi is going to post in the chat for you now. If you're short on time, as we all are, there's a 2-page executive summary that you could read instead, or actually a 1-page illustrated summary as well. So our aim then was to better understand students' views on and experiences of campus securitisation with this specific focus on security services and the police. And we explored these issues using 3 data sets that we generated between sort of the summer of 2022 and the end of 2022. So firstly, we conducted 30 semi-structured interviews with students at 3 universities in Greater Manchester. And we thought the region of Greater Manchester, we chose it because it has kind of a diverse university landscape. So there's representation from institutions with different student demographics, different course tariffs, different relative proportions of home versus international and commuter versus residential students, and also because we had pre-existing connections with those institutions. We submitted freedom of information requests at those 3 universities as well. And then we did a national survey of 635 students to establish a broader picture. so across the UK of campus securitisation. What we hope then is that the report contributes to ongoing conversations around campus securitisation, but what it's definitely showed us is that there's much more work to be done in this area. What we'll do now then, I'm going to pass over to Remi in a moment, but Remi will summarise some of the headline quantitative findings, and then we'll talk you through 4 key areas of concern that were raised by our participants, the students in our project, pertaining to racism and boundary policing, the policing of student activists, responses to mental health crises, and then sexual violence. And we'll spend more time on the latter. As we talk you through the issues, the themes of activism and mental health, we'll also try to think a little bit about how they relate to sexual violence as well. We're drawing quite heavily on quotes from participants here. When you see a name afterwards, that signals it's one of our interviewees, and we've used pseudonyms. Where there's no name after the quote, they're quotes that we've taken from the national survey. What we'll do is we'll finish up our presentation with a brief discussion around students' perceptions of universities' lack of accountability and students' reflections on some of the alternatives that there might be to relying on campus security as a way of dealing with harm. All right, I'll pass over to you, Remi.
Hi, everybody. So, in terms of the broad quantitative findings, firstly, we found that security services are a very real and significant presence on university campuses and in the lives of students. About 3/4 of survey respondents said that they see campus security at least once a week, and more than 1/3 of respondents saw campus security services daily. For us, this makes it even more peculiar that such little research has been carried out on campus security in the UK. And not only this, but the role of campus security services rarely features as part of the broader conversations about student experiences, inequality, and specifically about institutional racism and sexism in higher education. And our findings also suggest that there's a significant uncertainty among students with regards to whether security services keep students safe. And this is despite the significant presence of security services in the day-to-day life of the institution, and despite the provision of safety purportedly being central to their purpose. As you can see there in the graph on this slide, only 31% of respondents said yes when asked whether university security keeps students safe. 42% of students were unsure, which really should raise a lot of questions for universities and those of us concerned about student experiences. And perhaps even more worryingly, more than 1/4 of students answered no. And when we look specifically at protected characteristics, which very crudely seek to shine a light on power and marginalization, you can see that the proportion of students who felt campus security keeps students safe is lower at 29% for those with protected characteristics than it is for those without, 48%, which suggests that not all students experience campus security in the same way. Those with marginalized or minoritized identities are less likely to feel security keep them safe, which perhaps really shouldn't be surprising when we look at wider patterns and experiences of policing, surveillance, and criminalization. Keeping that in mind, I want to turn now to look briefly at some of the key areas of concern from the research, starting with this theme of racism and boundary policing. And one of the questions that we asked survey respondents was whether they felt that some students were more likely than others to have an encounter with campus security personnel. Nearly 3/4 said yes. And when we then asked which factors influenced this, race was the most common response, and that was selected by 78.6% of those respondents, was followed by gender at 61.7%, and then by social class and migrant status. And of course, it's worth noting that for many students, these factors overlap. They're not easily disentangled. They shape their experiences in complex and interconnected ways. And returning to that question of safety from the previous slide, when we explored this further in terms of race, we found that 47.1% of Black students felt security services do not keep students safe. That compares to 26.7% of all racially minoritized students and 27.7% of white British students. So it points to something specific about Black student experiences, or perhaps it asks us to consider the particular ways in which anti-Black racism shape interactions with security services. And these concerns about safety start to make even more sense when we listen to what students told us in their own words. The qualitative responses, both from the survey and from the interviews, paint quite a stark picture. Racially minoritized students and Black students in particular describe being racially profiled and treated harshly by campus security officers. As one survey respondent put it, and I quote, "Campus security approach students, especially Black, people of color, and visibly Muslim students very aggressively." And this sentiment was echoed by many others. Racially minoritized students often find themselves entangled in institutional efforts to exclude or keep off of campus non-students, or those constructed as potential criminals, or dangerous others, as Nicola Roberts puts it. In other words, they become caught up in what we might call boundary policing, a practice that not only shapes security interactions, but also raises deeper questions about who belongs on campus and whose presence is seen as being legitimate. The next theme I want to highlight here pertains to the policing of student activists. We found that student activists are particularly vulnerable to negative encounters with campus security. Many participants involved in activism described experiences of physical violence, verbal abuse, and online harassment. And just to give you some sense of what this looked like, one survey respondent recalled, and I quote, "We tried to occupy a building and a security guard assaulted me. He kneed me in the thigh, leaving a bruise that was there for a week or two, and then threw me to the floor before climbing on top." They also went on to recall how the security officers directed violent, sexist language towards them. And Henry, who was one of our interviewees, said, "I organized a sit-in. I read out the conclusions of the police report into a mic and it was live streamed on YouTube. Some security were watching the live stream on their phones. We could see through a window. And the comments on the live stream called me homophobic and transphobic slurs." For Henry, who is drawing on a wider set of negative experiences with campus security, there was a very real possibility or likelihood that this abuse was coming from security personnel. And these accounts reveal not only surveillance and repression, but also connecting to the broader theme of sexual violence, the way in which encounters with security can become sites of homophobic, transphobic, and gendered abuse. So for queer and trans students, this kind of harassment reminds us that campus security often exposes students to violence rather than protecting them from it. And more broadly, I think it's important that we don't treat issues like racism, gendered violence, and the policing of activism as separate, which is a bit of a risk in the way that we've structured the report and also the way that we've structured this presentation. But if we look at what the students are saying, what emerges from their experiences and what we're trying to show here is that protests and demonstrations frequently become sites where racialized, sexualized, and queerphobic harm is enacted through security and policing. So it was in this context of violence, not safety, that Henry described campus security as actively a danger. With this, he's inviting us to see security services not as a neutral solution to campus violence, but as part of the problem, as an actors of violence themselves. And one additional point to make here with regards to the policing of student activists is that the effort to control and surveil student activists is a key driver in bringing police onto university campuses. And student activists then are particularly vulnerable to negative encounters with police which can see them criminalized, drawn into the criminal justice system, and that can have profound consequences. Now to think briefly about responses to mental health incidents. Now, the context is that demand for university wellbeing services is way outstripping the provision that's on offer. And in this context, security officers are often positioned by institutions as the first responder to mental health incidents on campus. Some participants shared positive experiences of security staff in this first responder role. One interviewee, for example, recalled security checking in on her friend after she had attempted to take her own life, and a few survey respondents commented on the kindness of individual security personnel, who was sometimes seen to be plugging gaps where there was a lack of provision. Many other respondents, though, reported less positive experiences and questioned why this critical first responder role was being performed by security staff rather than by wellbeing teams that should have the specialized skills and knowledge to respond to mental health incidents. And the accounts in our research first question the suitability of campus security to the role of first responder. We see this in the account from a survey respondent who said, and I quote, "When I was distressed, suicidal on campus, security came and talked to me. I found them quite intimidating and scary, and the big, bulky police-type uniform they wore made my distress worse. It felt like I was in trouble and everyone was looking at me because I was with security." Secondly, and these two strands overlap somewhat, there were accounts that maintained that security personnel had actually worsened mental health crises. One survey respondent recalled security acting as first responders when her flatmate had attempted to take her own life. In their own words, and I quote, "They told her she had done something silly. This was while she was still on the floor with a rope round her neck." And another wrote, quote, "I felt really threatened when they came into my room unannounced several times, especially when I was a female, autistic, and had experienced sexual assault while at university. Security were not sympathetic to my condition, nor the fact I was panting, screaming, and crying." And in this account, we see or get a glimpse of how a range of factors, gender, disability, and experience of sexual violence coalesce to shape experiences with campus security. And just to add, we also found that, particularly for students from minoritized groups or with prior experience of harm at the hands of security personnel or police, the general presence of security personnel, or indeed police on campus, in and of itself, can have a negative impact on their mental health.
Thanks, Rem. Well, I think hopefully we've started to surface some of this in the areas of concern that Remi's talked you through, but we now wanted to turn more directly to gender and the theme of sexual violence. So our national survey found that just 29% of women respondents felt that security services keep students safe. And this is even lower for trans and non-binary students, where only about 23% felt that campus security keeps students safe. Beyond perceptions of safety then, some participants, and again, this was via the survey, but also the interviews as well, reported direct experiences of sexism, misogyny, and transphobia from security staff. So, for example, one survey respondent reported, and I quote, "Campus security were constantly flirting and making inappropriate comments towards female students. One has asked me if I like BDSM and made other disgusting comments and making unwarranted advances on us." Accounts like this one highlight how, for some students, security personnel are not only failing to ensure safety or make them feel safe, but they are themselves enactors of harm. When students reported experiencing sexual violence on campus, including at the hands of other students, they often said that they found campus security's response to be both inadequate and at times harmful. As Nicholas, one of our interviewees, explained, and I quote, "I have quite a few friends that have been involved in some incident involving sexual assault or rape, and quite often they felt just not heard, be that by security or police." And similarly, Olivia, recalling a specific incident, said, "I think victim blaming is a huge thing. The university shouldn't be victim blaming, and that's what they did." So in this sense, what our research echoes is an observation that's been made elsewhere by some of you on this call, including in Alison and Young's important research with the NUS, for example, that survivors of sexual violence on campus are too often not listened to or believed when they report sexual violence, and often feel dismissed or under-supported by and within their institutions. We suggest that security services play a key role in this culture of disbelief. We wanted to pull out one specific story now. This relates to drink spiking, which lots of our participants brought up. It seemed to be kind of a huge issue on campuses when we did our research. So this is Sarah's story. Sarah's one of our interviewees. So Sarah had her drink spiked when she was on a night out with some friends in the student union bar that was on campus. Sarah said that she very quickly realised that her drink had been spiked, that she hadn't been drinking alcohol that evening, and so she spotted quite early that she was feeling unwell. She recalled seeking help from a member of the bar staff, who then informed a member of the security team who was working that evening. Instead of receiving help from the security personnel, Sarah said that she was immediately dismissed. So she recalled how the security officer, and just note at the start of the quote here, for Sarah, there was something significant about this security officer being a woman. The security officer told the member of bar staff, Sarah could overhear, "She definitely hasn't. She's lying. She's only been there 10 minutes. When Sarah then persisted to insist that she had had her drink spiked, the response, Sarah said, from the security officer shifted from one of denial to blame. Sarah said that she was told by the security officer, "This is your fault. If you didn't want to get your drink spiked, you shouldn't have left your drink unattended. You need to be more careful." Sarah described how at this point, visibly distressed, her friend began to help her out of the bar. On the way out, Sarah said other security staff approached her and a friend and asked if they were okay. And hoping for a different response, Sarah re-explained what had happened while, in her own words, violently crying. She said she was met with laughter. She recalled, and I quote, "The bouncers are all laughing at me. I'm violently crying and they repeat the same thing to me again. Oh, well, did you leave your drink unattended?" In asking this, Sarah said that she felt that security personnel were reinforcing blame. So not doing anything to kind of ease her fear or her distress, and in fact, actually making the situation a whole lot worse. And she recalled, and I'm again quoting from Sarah's interview, feeling scared, panicked, and hysterical. That the victim blaming attitudes are apparent not just from that initial encounter with the first security officer, but later from other security officers too, I think points to a problem that extends beyond the bad practice of an individual member of staff. And it also demonstrates that the distress that comes as a result of having your drink spiked, or indeed any act of violence or harm, can be exacerbated by the reaction of security. Sarah's experience then wasn't just confined to that specific evening. After the incident, Sarah said that she sent an email to the security team explaining what had happened. And in response, she said that they asked her for a phone number, and she later spoke with someone on the phone who she believes was the deputy head of security at the university where she was a student. According to Sarah, this person was profusely apologising and outraged at what had happened. And she said that he assured her that he would request that his boss fire the security officer involved, even though Sarah said she was clear in her own words, and I quote, that this was a manifestation of a bigger problem, and that firing one person wasn't necessarily what she was asking for. The member of staff said that he would get back in touch with Sarah the following day, but that didn't happen. So a day later, Sarah made contact with him. And she said that she was told, and I again quote from Sarah, "The lady's been fired. Nothing like this will happen again to another girl." Satisfied that her case had been handled, even if a bit conflicted or feeling a bit disempowered about the course of action, Sarah said she felt fine. She's fine about the situation. However, later, she discovered, and I quote from Sarah here, 2 weeks later, there's a gig on at the SU and I'm walking past. I turn back from the uni and the woman who had harassed me outside is still there. She's still doing her security job and she still had a job. So the uni lied to me and told me that she'd been fired even though she hadn't. So Sarah then reached out to the person that she'd liaised with. And she said she was told by them that the university outsources its security services to a third-party company, and that had made it much more difficult than anticipated for the security officer to be dismissed. So Sarah, still determined to push for some kind of change, said that she tried to offer some advice on ways that security training might be improved from a student's perspective, so reflecting on her experience that evening. And she said that she directed them to some third-party organisations that could help. But from this point, Sarah says she was ignored. She tried to follow up again on a couple more occasions, but then understandably gave up. So for us then, this story, I think, highlights at least two important things. Firstly, the kind of lack of agency that was afforded to Sarah in determining what redress would be appropriate. So rather than listening to what she wanted, security sort of rushed to resolve the issue on their own terms. And then secondly, that the sort of harm and confusion caused by the misleading information kind of made the situation worse. So being falsely assured that the officer had been fired seemed to then exacerbate Sarah's distress, reinforcing rather than addressing the initial harm.
As in Sarah's case, as well as in the case of Zach Aiden, which we mentioned earlier in the presentation, many of our participants described how the initial negative encounters that they'd had with campus security were often made worse by the way universities handled or failed to handle the students' complaints. And there are clear parallels here with Sarah Ahmed's work on complaint more generally in higher education. Those we spoke to reported facing blockages, coming to dead ends, and facing resistance in the institution. They seem to be caught up in what Alison has described as the kind of institutional airbrushing, which acts to protect the reputation and market value of neoliberal institutions, often at the expense of those who've been subject to harm. And in our research, the difficulties students faced when seeking redress, through institutional channels at least, largely fell into two areas. First, students struggled to even access complaint processes. As Billy said, it'd be really hard to find who you would raise that complaint to. There's not like a designated website or email address, and even if there is, it's not easy to find. And this point was really underlined for us by the fact that at one of the universities where we submitted freedom of information requests, between 2018 and 2022, only 2 official complaints had been recorded, neither of which were upheld. But tellingly, this figure is actually lower than the number of students from that university in our study who told us that they'd made an official complaint during the same period, despite us having a relatively small sample size. So the implication here is that complaints are seemingly getting lost in the system or not making it into the system. And secondly, students who did engage in the complaint process found it tedious and exhausting. Sarah said, "I think the university relies on the fact that their processes are annoying and disheartening, and so much so that they make you not pursue it. It makes you feel that you can't be asked." And what's being described here is something akin to what Sarah Ahmed calls strategic inefficiency, a concept that highlights how delays and bureaucratic obstacles are not accidental failures of the system, but rather how the system is designed to work. And in this context, where existing university complaint processes were felt by participants to neither confront the risks nor repair the harms associated with the securitization of campuses, we wanted to briefly consider student-led resistance and alternative responses to harm. So, alongside the increase in securitization of campuses since the 1960s, various forms of student-led resistance have emerged. This is seen at the national level in policy passed by the National Union of Students to limit the presence of police on campus, including in its securitization, surveillance, and prevent policy, and also in policy to end sexual violence on campus passed in 2022, in which the NUS pledged to encourage non-carceral approaches that centre care and healing, noting that, and I quote, "Security exists to protect the property of the university and enforce the management's policies against students, not to protect students from harm." And to give an example at the more local level, students at the University of Manchester set up the Cops Off Campus group that monitored students and security on campus. The Students' Union also passed a motion to ban police and military from entering student union buildings in 2022. At the same time, and more worryingly, other participants reported feeling so tired and disillusioned by resisting in a context where they didn't feel heard by their institution that they ended up disengaging from campus life. For some, that involved stopping coming onto campuses and attending classes. But for at least one participant, it meant leaving the university without finishing their course. And we asked students to reflect on what a safe campus looks like or could look like. And they identified a range of things. Some pointed to reforms to security services, such as removing outsourced labour, extending training, including in equality, diversity, and inclusion issues. And some called for changes to the uniforms of security personnel, claiming that, in the words of one participant, because they dress like the police, they act like the police. And this change in uniform was seen by some participants to be part of a wider set of changes that are needed to transform the role of security services that would see them prioritizing student welfare. That is to say, it was about more than just the uniform for many of the students. Other students called for investment to be directed away from security services to explicitly non-carceral responses to addressing harm. Initiatives designed to minimize harm without doing more harm. These initiatives were understood by some participants as being better equipped to tackle the root causes of harmful behaviours on campuses, including harmful behaviour between students. And a very common theme to emerge both from the interviews and the national survey was that participants would like to see more investment in wellbeing and counselling services, though one participant urged caution around overlooking the power imbalances operating in those systems too. And others suggested that we look to invest in building significant and free late-night transport systems for students, as well as setting up or investing in existing peer support systems. Others still said that universities need to disband partnerships with the police in favour of building new ones with mental health organisations, anti-racism groups, groups working with survivors of sexual violence, and groups that support and assert the rights of queer, trans, and/or disabled people. Now, just to wrap up before hopefully hearing some thoughts and questions, a significant body of research has found that women students often feel unsafe on campus because of the threat and the reality of sexual violence. This is also evident in our research, where we see that cis women and trans and non-binary students are subject to particular forms of violence on campus. And research such as that conducted by Nicola Roberts has been important in engaging with this lack of safety for women students and thinking about security. And this is really welcome, and it's a conversation that we want to add to. But where some suggest that increased surveillance and securitization might be a necessary intervention, our research raises questions about how institutions might respond. Whilst the dominant logic might be to call for more security, more police, more surveillance, all in the name of tackling sexual violence, our research shows that this is problematic because, one, security services do not make all students feel safe, and this is particularly acute for some. Two, security services are ill-equipped to prevent and address harm. Three, security services can and do directly cause harm. And four, security services can and do exacerbate harm when tasked with responding to it. And if we think back specifically to the slide on racism and boundary policing that we discussed earlier, we can see how calls for increased security to protect women risks intensifying the very systems that harm Black and other racially minoritized students. In other words, the push for securitization, often framed as a response to gendered and sexual violence, ends up reinforcing racialized and class surveillance and harassment, making campus an even more exclusionary space for those already at risk of profiling and harm for securitization. And this might, on a superficial glance, seem like a tension or a contradiction, where the needs of racially minoritized students are juxtaposed with the needs of women. But a crucial point here is that securitization remains unable to meaningfully live up to the aims of keeping women safe anyway. For all of these reasons, we're suggesting that there's a need to find different routes to tackling sexual violence and harm and violence more broadly. And it is here that we suggest that it's useful to draw on abolitionist thinking. We don't claim to have all of the answers, and nor should we. We think the answers need to be developed through dialogue, led by students. But what we do know is that real safety doesn't come through more surveillance and securitization. It comes from fostering environments where harm is actively prevented, where survivors are genuinely supported. This means exploring alternatives, whether that's through survivor-centered support systems, consent education, community accountability models, or rethinking how security operates on campus altogether. More work is needed to develop and implement these approaches, but the starting point has to be recognizing that securitization will not deliver the safety that students need. So we want to offer then a note of caution against going down the same old well-worn tracks that lead to more harm and less safety. And lastly, we just say that there is a need for much more research in this area. Our work was no doubt shaped by the particular time in which we carried it out, particularly pertaining to COVID, also Black Lives Matter. So there's a need for more research that looks at the situation post-COVID, as well as work that looks more specifically at security and sexual violence, work in more depth on individual university campuses, and work that looks at the securitization, policing, and institutional responses to Palestine protesters in recent years. And I know some of that work is being conducted by Alice Saria and Maddie Abbas at Lancaster at the moment. And it may be a mistake, however, to assume that all is needed is more research and evidence. And we hope that this is where campaigns and activism might be born or revitalized. So we're happy to leave it there. You can see there's a QR code there on the slide for the report, but I think Alison's already shared it in the chat. And thanks everybody for listening and engaging.
Thank you so much, both. I'm very impressed with your QR code for your report. That's very fancy. I mean, I know I've read it before, but it's such an amazing report, and I kind of have forgotten how amazing it is. It's so useful, it's so powerful, and there's so much data. I really do think everybody should read it. I don't remember coming up with the title. Did I really come up with the title? Did I? I don't remember that. And as you say, there's so much relevant to sexual violence here. You know, security staff are not good at responding to it. They sometimes make it worse. They also enact sexual violence. I mean, we had experience of that at Newcastle at one of our pro-Palestine rallies. I think there was at least one sexual assault by security, and security staff were also ripping off women's hijabs as well. So it really, really appalling stuff. So as you say, there's that level of it. And there's also the deeper level of securitization, you know, and the fears that, especially in relation to sexual violence, that the UK is going in the direction of the US, in which, you know, the campus is figured as a hunting ground where outsiders pick off female students. I think Sharon Cowan's on this call, and she's written about that and about the criminal justice drift in anti-sexual violence work on UK campuses. So as you say, some activists are asking for more security personnel, but even the ones that aren't, there are also securitized narratives, you know, that idea of boundary policing that you talked about, who's an insider, who's an outsider, who's legitimate and who's not, who's protected and who the protectors are, and how all of that is racialized and classed, as well as being gendered. So I think there's so much in your report for sexual violence activists, and you know, maybe we can all do some research together. I think that would be a really powerful thing to do. So I'll open up to questions now. I think there might be one in the chat already. Feel free to put your hands up as well if you want to ask a question, but there's one here from Grace in the chat. Please, could you speak a bit more on the perceptions and experiences of racially minoritized international students? How do they differ from racially minoritized home students? That's such a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't think we can offer a particularly interesting answer on it because we don't have, we'd really need to drill down into it, I think. But what I would say is that institutions seem to suggest that part of the reason for the securitization is to cater for international students who purportedly feel unsafe on university campuses. But that seems to be a lot of speculation on the part of institutions, and I think there really does need to be research looking specifically at international students' experiences of this. So yeah, I mean, that's not much of an answer, but it's something to look into.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to add anything to that, Laura? Or
No, I think Remi's right. I think we need to go back to our survey data and look at that a bit more. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that's the dominant logic. It's one of the kind of narratives that we hear. I mean, some of our interviewees were racially minoritized international students. I think, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things maybe to add to that notion of boundary policing that you brought back up again, Alison, I think maybe something to kind of emphasize there is, you know, students play a key role in that, kind of like the demand for the policing of the university's physical boundaries, the notion of keeping criminal outsiders off of campus. That comes from the institution, but it also comes from students as well. It is a kind of demand that they wanted. And I think we did see that certainly from memory, a couple of the international students that we interviewed as well. And of course, that construct of the outsider, keeping the outsider or the potential criminal off campus, that they're not race neutral terms. So of course that has impacts for how other racially minoritized students experience campus and the interactions that they might have with campus security.
I think one other thing to highlight there as well is the border regimes on our university campuses that insist that international students have to be in specific places at specific times, which really overlaps a lot with this, what essentially we're talking about, social control of students. And that's certainly a big problem. My institution, I know it is a lot of institutions in the UK.
And Grace is doing a report at Birmingham on specific experiences of racialized international students. So come back and tell us, Grace. Come back and tell us what you find, because it's such an important issue. I'm going to go to Tanya, who's got her hand up, and then I'll come back to the chat because Malukan has a question in the chat. So go first, Tanya.
Hey, thank you. So my question was about whether there was any variety in terms of security being outsourced or not, because you mentioned, the effects of kind of outsourcing. And I say this because at our university several years ago, the Unison branch launched a successful campaign to bring security back in-house. And it has actually improved relations between staff, students, and security. So security do other things besides policing. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but, they're also very heavily unionized. And so staff and student groups liaise with them through the union, as well as officially through the university. And particularly on Palestine, the security staff have been a lot better than the institution itself, because the Unison branch is very pro-Palestine. So, I mean, it's not a perfect situation, but it is a bit different. And so I did wonder if you had looked at kind of the differences between outsourcing and security staff who are employed in the institution.
Yeah, I can have a go. Yeah, I think the way you've articulated it there is consistent with our perspective on it. We want to be careful not to suggest that ending outsourcing and bringing security in-house is the solution, but looking at the accounts of our participants in the interviews particularly, but also in the surveys as well, there's a clear, consistent sense that outsourcing exacerbated the problems with campus security. And you really see that very clearly in Sarah's account that we shared in the presentation. And often at a lot of universities, it's complex and variegated system anyway, where there might be some outsourced members or some outsourced elements of the security provision and others that are in-house. But yeah, I mean, I think in the report, we do suggest that outsourcing is part of the problem.
Yeah, have you got anything to add to that, Laura? It's so interesting you said that, Tanya, as well, because I was going to ask about outsourcing, and the Birkbeck experience sounds like what you might predict it would be. But obviously, as Remi said, that's not the solution, but it is obviously part of the problem. So there's a question here in the chat from Malukan, which is about how can we link such findings to the media and the political context during the time of data collection. So you collected your data, as you said, around COVID time and around the time of George Floyd's murder. Do you think that had an impact, and how? And I mean, I guess following on from that, we're in a political context now, which is, perhaps even more extreme in some ways. So, maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, not sure quite so much about the media influence, but I definitely think our data was a product of its time. So yeah, in terms of kind of it coming in with the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter mobilization, students in both the survey, but particularly the interviews, very often kind of juxtapose the experiences that they'd had against the kind of declarations that their institutions were giving at the time. So they were, kind of saying that we've had these experiences, but we know that our institution is currently telling everyone, that it's supporting Black Lives Matter and it's thinking about racism and other forms of inequity. So I think the way that it kind of was shaped was a it helps students to juxtapose their experiences against the rhetoric, I think. Yeah, I guess COVID as well. Again, not quite so sure in terms of the question about how media stories influenced. But I mean, again, our research was really heavily influenced by the COVID period. So what we didn't talk to much in that presentation there was some of the data that we had around COVID impact. So, for example, lots of participants were speaking about how the increased securitization as a result of COVID brought a whole range of students into contact with security services that had never really had to deal with that before. But that still, it was racially minoritized students in particular that were having the more intense, particularly negative, particularly harmful encounters. Some of our students, there was really some really very, very worrying data around COVID, actually. Students talking about campus security, working with police, and campus security were opening the doors of students' halls of residence and allowing police to enter in order to check whether students were conforming to COVID restrictions. So I may have gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but I guess, yeah, I wanted to highlight that, yeah, I think our research definitely was informed by the kind of political and social situation at the time. Yeah, Rem, maybe you've got some more other reflections that speak more to the kind of role of the media. I don't know.
Similar to what you're saying, really, I think I'm just so struck by how the context temporally shapes the research that comes out. I think if we'd done our research a year later, it would really central to it would have been the policing of Palestine protesters. And students would have been really sensitized and attuned to what was going on there. And it still features in our research because it's been a long standing issue, the mistreatment of those standing up for Palestine liberation. But a year or so, either way, we'll get different results, even if still pointing to the fundamental problems with securitization. But for Black Lives Matter, which was prevalent in the media at the time, Laura made the point about students really finding some of the institutional statements very jarring alongside their experiences. But the case of Zach Aden at the University of Manchester, I think, linked what was going on in the US, the murder of George Floyd in the US, to the racist policing in the UK, and then very obviously to how this manifests on campus. And some of the people that we spoke to said that they'd cried when they saw this video go viral of a Black student being assaulted by campus security on the University of Manchester campus. It really shaped students' experiences, particularly racially minoritized and Black students. And again, on the context, the Fencegate incident at the University of Manchester, as it was called on the campus, where the university suddenly erected barriers around student halls, completely unexpected to students. Part of the reason that students were so angry and upset about that is because of the way that COVID had impacted on students' mental health to such an extent that in those very halls, a student had taken their own life just weeks preceding that. So students were dealing with the impact and the trauma of that, and then made to feel like they were being imprisoned by the people running the university. So yeah, that wider context that manifests through the media shaped fundamentally what we heard in that period.
Yeah, thanks, Remi. I remember that, the Fencegate at Manchester, absolutely shocking. It was absolutely shocking, even watching it from, well, I was in Brighton at the time. There's a question in the chat from Claire, which is about campus securitization extended into apps like Safe Zone, which I think we have at Newcastle actually. And did many of your participants say much about these types of apps?
Very little. And I don't know if that's probably, I think, because of the way we ask the questions. We conducted quite a narrow study focusing on security personnel. So we got some bits about CCTV and the wider securitization apparatus, but less. So I think it's partly through design, but partly I think because these systems have become more and more prevalent, even in the time since we conducted the research. So yeah, I mean, as we said, I think that there is more research to be done on all of this.
Yeah, a lot more. There's a comment in the chat from Nicola Roberts, who I think you know, about work not across sites, but that tends to show that as women and men move away from campus and into the city, they feel less safe, but also that the presence of uniformed campus security enhances perceptions of safety in women students and international students. I wonder which women those would be as well, and potentially which international students those would be. I don't know whether you want to say a bit more about that, Nicola, or whether Laura or Remi, you want to make any comment. I mean, I guess some of that's about perceptions of safety, isn't it? And who feels safe, but also I guess what we fear and why we fear it comes into that too, doesn't it? And there is often a gap between what we fear and what we're at risk of. And the gap tends to be filled by things like race and class. So I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, I was just holding off to see if Nicola did want to come in, or Laura, I don't know if you want to say anything, but yeah, do you mind? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to follow up on what Alison said, I think it was definitely the case that some of the women students or international students in our study did have positive things to say about the role that campus security plays. So yeah, you know, some of them did say that they felt more secure, knowing that campus security were present, they're policing the boundaries. I guess maybe just as a side note there, I think what we found when we did our FOI requests and our analysis of job roles of security personnel was that institutions see security personnel as having a whole range of roles, an ever-expanding range of roles that go from things like kind of protecting university property to being these first responder roles, and looking after students, keeping students safe is just kind of one in a long, long list of roles. So students often felt like the primary role of security personnel should be to keep them safe. And as I was saying there, I think for some students, they felt that that was happening. But I don't think that was universal by any stretch. And as you saw from our data, lots of women students didn't feel safe as a result of security being there. And yeah, and I think for lots of our interviewees and our survey respondents as well, it wasn't just the case that they weren't feeling safe as a result of campus security or the police, but that they had actually had experiences of direct harm as a result. So yeah, I guess, you know, a bit of a kind of a difference of findings there. Rem, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, just to say, I mean, in our survey, it's a minority of students. I think about 30% that said that campus security make them feel safer. And I think if you apply a power analysis to that and think about students who are particularly marginalized or minoritized, then, you know, I think we should always be starting from the point of those in minoritized and marginalized positions to have an inclusive and welcoming environment. And that's what we try to do in the research. And also, I think some of the qualitative accounts in our research really start to unpick the difference between a perception of safety and a reality of safety. And there's probably some abolitionist work to be done around thinking about what alternatives might look like. Because in the absence of an abolitionist imaginary, people are inclined to say, let's have more police, let's have more security. But we need to think about what else might be on offer that, you know, gets to the root causes of unsafety or violence or whatever the issues might be.
Yeah, and just to tag on the end of that, kind of just going back to my point about this ever expanding kind of the expanding roles of campus security, I think tied to that, and this difference between kind of imagined and real sense of security is that very often security services kind of have like a role conflict going on. So it's that they're simultaneously tasked with policing the boundaries of campus, enforcing the law, keeping the peace, and it sees them come into conflict with student activists and others. At the same time, they're expected to be the first responders to mental health crises. They're expected to plug the gaps when there's no availability for student counselling and wellbeing because it's so underfunded. So I think there's something there about kind of role conflict as well that I think kind of starts to account for why you do get kind of students having quite different views around whether campus security keep them safe or not.
And I found your work really, really useful, Nicola, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That's a good place to kind of round it off, especially talking about the alternatives to campus security and the fact that there is a lot of work still to be done. And, I really meant that, sexual violence researchers and activists and people working on campus security, we ought to work together, really, to try and come up with some of these types of alternatives. So thank you so much to both of you for this brilliant report and for coming and talking to us about it as well. And thanks very much to everybody who attended. I'm just going to stop the recording now and then we can wind up.